Good evening. This is a really special occasion for me. I think this is a really special occasion for us as a school. I am so happy that you're all here. I think we are all in for a wonderful treat. I am grateful that Scott Cohen has agreed to give this talk, and to Nicolai Ouroussoff for agreeing to engage Scott in a discussion. So we've got quite a lot ahead of us. We'll try to be brief. Basically, the structure of tonight's presentation will be that Scott will begin by talking for about 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, kind of smaller focus lecture, and then this will be followed by a response from Nicolai. And then after that, of course, both Scott and Nicolai will have engaged in a discussion, and then we will all have an opportunity to also ask them questions about the things that Scott has presented and what we have talked about. I must admit that I feel very unprepared for introducing Scott Cohen. Those of you who know Scott are fully aware of the fact that he begins his introductions, which are generally written, very beautifully written, very precise, and quite long, and often more precise than some of the lectures that actually follow his beautifully written introductions. So I'm unprepared, and I will try to be brief. I will tell you that it was really a great opportunity for me not so long ago, only a couple of weeks ago, to actually be in Tel Aviv and to go and see the museum. It was part of a very important and interesting trip that we took with a number of people from Harvard, with the deans of the business school, law school, the ed school, and of course a number of faculty from the business school, some of whom are here, to be in Israel and to, amongst other things, to see buildings. And it was a really special moment because, of course, I'd seen the drawings of the building. I had been there, but I was not quite prepared for seeing the building in the way that you experience it. It's not a building that is an object in a way completely visible. From a distance, you arrive into a plaza, and then you walk through, and you walk along the side of the building. And all the things that Scott is interested in and we're interested in about the outside, about its geometry and so on, it's actually very interesting that you see it very close up. You're next to the building, you see the window, you see through the window, you see the relationship between the window and the panel, and you walk along it and you turn, and then you enter, and of course you come into the building, and of course the main element of this building is this central space that you have seen, and it's very, very important the way in which this central space really deals with the phenomenon of compression, with the way in which we all know Scott is interested in phenomena like distortion and so on. So one of the things is really my point one, and I don't want to give his mini lecture, but it's really important, this idea of the site and Tel Aviv and the experience of the building and this use and the emphasis on distortion, the kind of compression of space. And the compression of this space actually happens in relation to a kind of near normalcy of the galleries themselves that are treated in a very relaxed and very kind of ordinary way. And yet this distortion also sets up a relational condition between the galleries, but maybe these are things that Scott will discuss. Second thing I want to say is about discourse. And in some way, I also feel a little bit nostalgic tonight because seeing Scott's drawings outside and seeing the exhibition and seeing the building is also, for me, a kind of reminder of an earlier history in this school when I witnessed, in a sense, firsthand Scott's development, his friendship, his growth, but his close relationship with Robin Evans. And really the idea that the issue of, for example, this book that I put together, Translations from Drawing to Building, the essays of Robin Evans, that I also now see, in a sense, translations from drawing to building in the work of Scott Cohen. And this, I think, also for me is a nostalgia in terms of Robin Evans that we both miss very much and who died so young, so tragically. And I think it's an amazing circle, in a way, of relationships between the kind of discourses that Robin was interested in and those that became really part of Scott's work. Third thing, and of course, questions around stereotomy and all these kinds of things. The third thing is about pedagogy. And what is really amazing in this project is the relationship that exists between teaching and the practice of architecture, and the way in which ideas from pedagogy to practice have been so precise, so poignant in the way that I think Scott has developed them and continued them. And lastly, I would say the exhibition, and I think this is something that Scott has touched on. If Tel Aviv is a site, there seems to be also an important thing about the GSD being a site. The site of those investigations, but also now the site to which this building returns and is now put on display. And therefore, the way in which now Scott has also rediscovered the Lightfall, for example, in between the crack of spaces in the gallery, there's something incredibly didactic about this exhibition and something very systematic about the explanation of all the drawings that go into the making of this building. So in some ways, I think it's really rare to find that level of kind of tour de force between pedagogy and practice. And I think we're very lucky, in a way, to have Scott Cohen with us, to see this develop during this particular period, and to now see it come into fruition. It's also really an incredible opportunity that Nicolai is here, as you know, for very many, many years. Nicolai was the architectural critic of the New York Times and was nominated on numerous occasions for the Pulitzer Prize. So I am sure, like me, you're all looking forward to hearing Scott talk about the project and Nicolai to engage Scott in discussion. Please welcome Preston Scott Cohen.
Thank you so much, Mohsen. I really wanted to begin by thanking you, but I think it was so poignant that you remembered our relationship with Robin. Indeed, you brought Robin to me. I really have to thank you probably more for that than even for this moment and the exhibition which you so warmly supported, and it was wonderful to work with everyone who was part of that project. I have to thank Ben Prosky and the team of Dan, who was just incredible working on this project, and out of my office, Ashley Merchant, who held it together from beginning to end. And I'd like to thank Michael Hayes for his beautiful text regarding Lightfall. I believe the most beautiful piece written yet about it. I truly feel that. Melissa Vaughn for working with us carefully on these, and far away, my colleagues in Israel, Amit Nimlik, the project architect, and Shuli Kislev, the acting director. So, tonight, it's not necessary, I think, to explain this project in terms of its overall genesis, the process of its design and construction, nor to tour you through it, since it is my hope that much of this can be garnered from the exhibition. Instead, I would rather like to explore the possibility of extrapolating other narratives that reframe the project as a unified and completed work. To this end, I will consider two interpretations. The first centers on the relationship between the museum as an institution and the museum in terms of its interior in the architectural sense. And the second concerns the effects of the city on the design of cultural buildings today more broadly by examining specific consequences of the relationship between the facade and the interior. So, I'll begin. I'll start with the dialectic between the museum and architecture. In the case of a contemporary art museum, if architecture tries to be anything other than arguably neutral, it inevitably runs into difficulties. Why is this so? We can look all the way back to the disappearance of the idea of the unity of the arts, in which architecture and other arts were part of the same aesthetic and spatial program. In other words, we can look to the founding of the museum and realize that neutral spaces in one form or another would become the only option. Once museums had isolated works of art and cut them off from their previous institutional contexts, all art became a part of art history, and its new context, the Universal Art Museum, spread across all the interchangeable neutral spaces around the world. Of course, there were a few rare non-neutral museums which don't take part in this, like the Isabella Gardner Stewart here in Boston, the Barnes Collection. But the non-neutral modern context for art really never came to fruition. In the New York Guggenheim, which was meant to house non-objectivist art, art ended up treating the museum as neutral, which in this case it certainly isn't, while the museum treats the art as if it were part of its own spatial aesthetic program, which it isn't. Neither is able to make the other what it needs to be. In the case of the Amir building at the Tel Aviv Museum, clearly it was thought that architecture should play a role, despite a great deal of ambivalence arising from the sort of problem that the Guggenheim makes all too explicit. This is owing to the desire to place the museum in this particular situation, dedicated to Israeli art in part, in the international arena, with architecture serving as a sign of foreignness. Yet the site makes the building practically invisible. This all made a lot of sense to me because it just so happens that I already possess in my work itself the same sort of ambivalence. It may be useful to think back to where we were 8 years ago when this project started. Then we could still feel the aftershocks of what had become a partisan dispute between two ideas of architecture and museums. One clearly represented by the Bilbao Guggenheim, the other by the Moma, both having recently or nearly completed their new buildings. Each in its own way was the end result of a process in which, as Nicolai Ouroussoff has written, museums have become, and I quote him here, as much about the stamp of legitimacy as about aesthetic pleasure, end quote. In the way that they dealt with this, the distinction between the two projects couldn't be clearer. One used architectural spectacle to bolster and invent itself as a museum, while the other sought to sustain itself as a myth that architecture could only have competed with. The latter, the greatest museum of modern art, is a framework without form, something more like urbanism in a way, a structure which supports numerous passing phases of art, while the Bilbao, as a model, along with the New York Guggenheim before it, frustrates curators and artists because Well, actually, it could do just as well without art. The MoMA of neutral spaces, when taken to its extreme, though accommodating, makes the museum almost indistinct from all other neutral buildings, hotels, government buildings, in which art is, alternately foregrounded and relegated to the status of decoration. The proportions of its galleries are determined more than anything by the need to hold massive crowds, and meanwhile, the best of the collection, the early modern paintings at the MoMA, were dwarfed, and the atmosphere of the original MoMA that we all knew and loved was ruined. There are other reasons that these museums do what they do to art and deal with the public as they do, and that Tel Aviv is somewhat different. Suffice it to say that the Bilbao and MoMA opposition was on my mind, and at some point led me to think that the Tel Aviv should be both architecturally distinguished and inconspicuous. Did it work out that way? I don't think we will know for a while, but I do think this, that Tel Aviv could be understood as an inversion of the Guggenheim, but not in the way that the MoMA is. This claim, this particular kind of inversion I'm talking about, entails traversing the history of museums, both as architecture and as institutions, types that do not always coincide. As we will soon see, that this architecture is inscribed in the New York Guggenheim. It is a historical transmutation that proceeds achronologically across museum and exhibition typologies. First, we can describe the Guggenheim as an exceedingly tall picture gallery. The picture gallery, originally a room in a palace like any other except covered floor to ceiling with art, began the codification of art, specifically establishing the superior status of a single medium, an aesthetic norm, oil painting and Italianate classicism. With the Louvre, the public museum expanded the ambition to exemplify, to include all mediums and representation techniques of painting, subsuming them under a comprehensive didactic history of art. The Guggenheim brings the two paradigms together by means of the processional ramp that allows visitors to rise up to see paintings at many levels. Of course, paintings stack higher here than in any of the antecedent picture galleries, to which one could imagine the space alludes. And from the ramp, the view across the atrium is that of a vertical succession of horizontal strips, perhaps the main reason it arguably evokes the picture gallery. Even the appearance of the slight vertical misalignments and the positions of partitions on the ramp, the structural fins, staggered with the ziggurat form of the building, create an effect similar to that of arrayed and stacked irregular frames. The superimposition of the ramp onto the tall picture gallery also alludes to the diorama, an entirely different genre, of course, of exhibition that cater to a new mass audience with popular themes from historical reenactments to sublime special effects of natural phenomena. Peculiarly, it is the equation of nature and artistry in the panoramic diorama, displayed as a copious, enveloping, singular collection that alludes to the precursor of the picture gallery, the cabinet of curiosities. The diorama, like the cabinet, taps into the desire to see reality through hyperreality, to understand ordinary life through extraordinary events and situations. The cabinet itself existed at a transitory scale between furniture and room, greater than an object for storage, but less than an architectural space. The Guggenheim is similarly caught between being a display device and a singular room. Its interior spiral is like an inhabitable shelf with human beings on display along with the art, appearing to be apprehensible from a single point, any point along the ramp. The museum was originally built to house a previously personal collection of non-objective painting. And in that sense, it invited the public in simultaneously for a private viewing and to join the display. The building architecturalizes both the desire for a private experience of art and, by implication, a similarly megalomaniacal desire for a direct symbiosis between art and life. Furthermore, the fact that the art is too small to appreciate in detail from across the atrium, the setting produces only the effect of excess and astonishment, implying that what is on display is actually the idea of a museum as a singular, all-encompassing collection. It is this model, a cornucopic microcosm, that corresponds to the Cabinet of Curiosities. Finally, reinforcing this, of course, is the exterior, an inexplicably eccentric form that breaks and foils the otherwise consistent walls of buildings that line a central park. A legible but enigmatic form, it is an object of curiosity within the city. In one sense, it suits a single type of exhibition, processional, chronological development, versus the open center in which anything can be suspended. The view across the Guggenheim's atrium, here again, presents the linearity itself as an idea, the continuous sweep of the ramp proceeding from the top to the bottom. The Guggenheim was meant to supplant the museum as an institutionally discrete domain. But its tyrannically processional itinerary, presented so unmistakably, ultimately contradicts this ambition. Far from its ambition to create a street-like experience, the Guggenheim comes to house but one highly specialized chapter within the larger master narrative art history, separated and spread across museums throughout the city and the world. In other words, while the architectural morphology produces an experience similar to the cabinet, the epitome of the all-encompassing microcosm, the museological adaptation to it produces a different type altogether, a processional sequence of rooms like those of a 19th century palace museum, albeit cut in half and grafted to an atrium. Walking along the ramp, the viewer's field of view is split down the center. On one side, we have the experience of inhabiting the processional sequence of rooms, and on the other, the multidimensional representation of the history of museum typologies, the cabinet, the picture gallery, and the diorama, all in one. And so we have this museum of two curatorial concepts. It is a functional adaptation, therefore, that exceeds the potentials of the original sources. And this makes it a particularly interesting problem to reflect on when you look back, for example, at the problems that arose in the period of wonders when the cabinets were so important and such extremes were regarded with such respect. These extremes, these anomalies. Now we see here the split, the enfilade, rooms cut in half. They demand an even more linear curatorial program than a normal processional museum would. While in a typical 19th century palace museum, movement proceeds through a looping itinerary as if the museum goer were carried along in a stream that forms eddies and whirlpools in each room. The half-room niches invite only minimal meandering as the museum goer proceeds to view a one-sided exhibit that hugs the wall. It performs at an intensified or higher level, therefore, than a normal enfilade sequence of galleries would. The Guggenheim imposes on the curator of this linear procession no matter how nonlinear the exhibition. But of course, today, curators do not want to use this building that way, and so they put things in like this. And there is an explosion of curatorial scenarios in which the linearity is defied. And now we turn finally again to Tel Aviv. Whereas the interior of the Guggenheim is architecturally like the cabinet, Tel Aviv works in a similar way as the cabinets once did, but not as the Guggenheim. Something else happens. It would be helpful to start with two related but contradictory organizational metaphors. First, Tel Aviv's interior can be understood as being caught between the two shelves of a Renaissance dome, where inner and outer surfaces follow different logics. One coarse, the other smooth, and play different semiotic roles. The inner one representing the infinity of the heavens, the outer symbolizing the church within the city, in this case. The principal interior dome, the lightfall, which cannot be occupied, but the inside of which can be seen as a coherent whole, follows the same geometric logic as the exterior facade dome, the facade, but is vertically attenuated relative to it. Of course, it is clasped by the galleries that rotate around it. We'll see that in a moment. The lightfall formally enacts and represents the contortion necessary to bring together a set of internally consistent galleries on a cramped triangular site, and in the process makes the disparate galleries a coherent unity. By enacting an extreme segregation of architectural form and institutional function, that is, of the curators, the lightfall amplifies each to opposite extremes, exhibiting what was, in that period of the curiosities, something often called perverse functionalism, wherein something performs even at a more heightened level than the normal circumstance would. And in this way, it inverts the synthetic unity of the Guggenheim, at the same time trading hyperprocessionality for curatorial flexibility. On the outside, Tama's coarse facade, the panelized curves, represent the movement of people through the public space around the building by its implicit twisting from a more normative geometry. Tama's facade behaves like the Guggenheim's ramp, immersive and experiential, as if the Guggenheim shell were turned inside out. The Tel Aviv facade twists with the perambulatory circulation around the building, guiding visitors to enter the building and the adjacent sculpture garden. Its anamorphic form intensifies the sequence of movement to and past the building. A contradictory reading complicates this, however. The way galleries and rims are organized around the lightfall is the same as the way exterior spaces, the garden and the public plazas, are organized in relation to the facade. The lightfall and the facade are then two equivalent surfaces built in relationship to outwardly oriented spaces. In this way, by extension, the wall of buildings surrounding the public buildings constitute a third surface with the set of spaces beyond them related as a broader band of space. And in this way, we could talk about it as a building that reverberates. Extending this narrative of transmutation to its logical ends, the city museum combination becomes analogous to the cabinet, which collects objects, be they the lightfall, the facade, the galleries, or even the plazas. And in this sense, Tel Aviv acts more like another idea of the museum, the endless museum, than those buildings which try to be literally endless. For another connection between the Guggenheim and the Tel Aviv is through Danny Tan's Tel Aviv Museum, the original building to which I've added, which is a variation on Corbusier's recurring ideal model of the museum, the universal museum, first envisioned in the Mundaneum. For is not the Mundaneum the true beginning of the Guggenheim lineage? The Guggenheim ramp refers to this previous spiraling museum, which was literally extendable and meant to contain everything. But let the final note be, however, that the literally ever-expanding museum always came to its demise and only partially realized pinwheel projects like the museums in Ahmedabad, Tokyo, and their distant cousin in Tel Aviv. These were the only manifestations that we can depend on, always fragmentary. Perhaps it is possible only to realize this fragment and a more apt ambition for a contemporary museum. The contemporary museum does not try to bring in and organize the world and subject it to a teleological trajectory, but rather creates equivalences between what can be experienced within a museum and situations out in the world. That is, the museum no longer follows its earlier didactic impulse, but is interested in exploring a wider range of subjectivities. Continuing the discussion of the relationship of the inside of the museum to the surroundings, I would like now to turn, and this will be much more brief, to the other genealogy that I mentioned at the beginning. This is the one about an architectural typological problem that involves the way in which interiors and exteriors are related to one another in cultural institutions. On the one hand, in the case of many large freestanding urban buildings, the hierarchy established by a single entrance is often practically inevitable. The systems of control and organization for such buildings demand specific points of entry. On the other hand, a contradictory requirement arises from within these large buildings: the need for the single building to contain essentially more than one building, each with the capacity to function independently with its own entrance. Thus, the hybrid building needs to behave like part of the city in two ways: as one building on the outside and more than one within itself. This genealogy worked on with Carl d'Appolito Dworkin in an incredibly exciting exchange over the course of the last 6 months regards the hypothesis that independent programs can participate in the production of a hybrid only under one condition. That is, when the primary motive is to establish for each program independently an isomorphic relationship between its inside and the outside of the whole building. Why? Because without this imperative, we do not have a hybrid building, but rather a collection of functions belonging to a single building, something more like a mall, for instance. Making the problem of the hybrid more difficult, as I mentioned before, is the need for each program to have its own entrance. For example, a library without its own entrance attached to a museum is just a room in the museum. Therefore, among the most contested spatial attributes of the hybrid building is the entrance. The Amir building has two separate primary functions. Actually, most people don't even really know this, but it is both a museum and a library. It has the largest Israeli art library. Yet because of its institutional responsibility to appear as one building, they are wrapped within a single form. A struggle for primacy arises, we have hypothesized, as each half of this building attempts to claim the exterior and the entrance for itself. The hypothesis begins this way. The building was initially 4 boxes, one of which was the library, which relegated the library to an inferior status. The library does a whole host of things to gain prominence in the scheme, including claiming the whole back half of the building for itself and becoming the end of the main circulation axis. Most strikingly, the library has a window, a very large window, which is the window of the entire building. And this window turns 90 degrees in elevation and twists all of the facades along with it, representing that the building envelope belongs solely to the library. The library occupies, then, the envelope in a free plan-like way, and, in this sense, sets up a historical foil to the museum, which adheres to a pre-modern paradigm of discrete galleries en filade. And so the library is ahead, historically. In a counter-move, the museum attempts to gain primacy by a very different means, mimesis. The lightfall, a vertically attenuated imitation of the facade, in the process of its logical generation, geometrically, rotates the galleries, establishing a stack of differently oriented plans encircling a vertical axis. In the tumult that results from the rotation of these galleries, which pull along the main axis to the library, and the library's continuing efforts to achieve the modernist dream of an all-encompassing and totalized interior, the ground is fractured, the section of the building produces progressively ascending sequences, the facades crack open in particular ways to allow for entrances. But in the end, despite all of its efforts to have it all for itself, the library fails to match the power of its nemesis, the lightfall, a space which is physically tied to the galleries and would seem, therefore, to belong to the old tradition, but which eludes association with any particular space that such a museum would have had and is outside of history, therefore. The contest would now seem to be between horizontality and verticality, as we see here, the facade so expressly horizontal, and the inside plungingly deep and vertical. But it was in one of the library's last efforts to establish dominance that the horizontal axis was extended by opening up the entrance before the long axis through the entire building that would culminate in the library. In the end, this gesture only ended up strengthening the museum's dominance by revealing the correspondence through the glass between the lightfall and the exterior from the outside. Here we can see the formal parallel between the lightfall and the envelope, the inner and the outer domes, and the logic of the museum's concentric appropriation. The hybrid problem is made all the clearer when compared to a most idealized type, the freestanding house. Here is this house, the Los Gatos family house in California, with a lineage back to an earlier house, the cornered house on the left, which has a very evident relationship to the Tel Aviv facade as well. Generally, the inside of a house has a direct relationship with the facade. It is conceivable that we can have doors into a house anywhere in constant accordance with this essential isomorphism. The rooms of the Los Gatos house are contained in a linear, one-room deep volume, which exaggerates the inside-outside contiguity, the isomorphism, and the placement of the windows reinforces the domestic type's isomorphism even further. But it is all undone when the volume succumbs to the form of a chevron because it must slope with the hill to avoid trees and to stay under a strict height limit. The facade's rigidity, deflected by the topography, forces the facade to separate from the interior. The ground continues into the apex, as you can see on the left, of the chevron, but in fact, this is an illusion. It turns out that this portion of ground in the apex is actually the roof of a space at the bottom of the image on the right that one descends to. And in this sense, the envelope of the house treats the interior as the lightfall treats its adjacent interiors. If the Tel Aviv is a multi-program building, which by its nature it cannot be isomorphic with its exterior, but is trying to become isomorphic, with each program vying to claim the entire envelope for itself, the house in Los Gatos, again, in this case, by its nature already isomorphic, is becoming just the opposite, that is, not isomorphic. They are each heading toward the other and moving in the opposite direction, and thereby thematizing the condition which has been of such importance for so long for all of these types. Just as an afterword, I would point out that one of the most remarkable and rewarding elements of all of this has been to witness what could never have been narrated and what could never be explained by an architect's way of thinking about genealogies, and that has been the way in which art has played a role in redefining the experience of the building. In each of these projects, interventions that couldn't have been foreseen of very different kinds in the contest between the two spatialities, the Museum of Neutral White Boxes and the Museum of Architectural Spectacle, of forms that invite interventions like Michael Ravner's piece, which moves along the boardcrete people, suggesting it is a landscape, or the opening ceremony by locomotion, which opened the building and represented an entirely different idea of space in a continuous morphing form. These and other events, the opening itself, and finally, the intervention here, I hope represent what might be the beginning of a different trajectory, another genealogy. Thank you very much. It's already on this one? Okay.
How's that working? How's that? Okay. I think I'm just going to make some, well, first I want to start by saying how refreshing it is to see an architect acknowledge any kind of genealogy in a project. My experience as a critic is that most architects expend a great deal of effort trying to erase any connection of the sources that they're looking at. So I thought it's a refreshing way to talk about the building. I think what I'll do, all I can really add at this point, and then we'll open up a discussion, is three kind of maybe more personal observations about points of discussion that we could have about the building. The first is maybe to pull back for a second and look at the three buildings we're talking about, the Guggenheim Bilbao, Moma, and this one, and talk about them in a more specific context. When I think of the Guggenheim Bilbao, I think of we're talking about the building opened in the late 90s, mid-90s. Two things, obviously, that most people here remember is the fall of the Berlin Wall, the kind of triumph of late capitalism, and Thomas Kranz, the Guggenheim's director's relationship to everything that was going on economically and politically in the world at that time, the idea that you can kind of brand art. And I think Frank Gehry also, which plays into this discussion, and I think that maybe you were responding to, but this idea that I think it's important to remember when you think about that building that it comes out of a period where for the first time, and I think this has a lot to do with the reaction that people had to that building, the architect allowed himself to place himself on the same level as the artist. And when you look at the exuberance and the emotional exuberance of the building and the response there was to that, even a discussion that Gehry often had and continues to have about the way he laid out the galleries. He always spoke of the architect and the artist as equals. And if you go back and look at either the big kind of whale-shaped hall, but more importantly, the galleries that are completely forgotten, probably because they're the worst, but the 7 smaller galleries that were meant to be collaborative spaces in the sense they were supposed to be occupied and used as artists, as installation space. That was a huge shift at the moment, I think, for architects, because for a long time, they had come out of a period where their voices, they felt, I think, had been somewhat suppressed. Moma, I think, is a different set of conditions because it's coming out of Bilbao, and there's a great deal of anxiety at Moma at that time about this terror that we repeat the mistakes of Bilbao, and that somehow they had to be true to their own modernist history. And at the same time, they realized that the narrative of modernism was falling apart. And I think when you look at that museum, a lot of the issues that come up in terms of what went right and what went wrong, especially what went wrong, was that you feel the anxiety both in the layout of the galleries from floor to floor, about them trying to figure out a new narrative without letting go of the old narrative, which was so key to their aura. And then your building, I think, comes out of, as you mentioned during your presentation, a response to both those buildings. I think at that point also, when you got the commission, the third important historical moment and hysterical moment was the competition at Ground Zero after September 11th, which, if there was still a sense among architects that you could get away with the kind of iconic buildings that Gehry had created at Bilbao after, I think, the hysteria of that competition and the sense of how it was exploited, both by political forces and by architects, it became much more difficult to do. And I think that, in a way, to me, has something to do with this idea of the middle ground, of trying to find some middle way between these two extremes, a way where you can still have a voice as an architect and at the same time a voice that's not arrogant or dominant. The second issue I think we should maybe talk about is this idea, which I find has gotten more extreme rather than less extreme, which is the division between people in the art world, curators, museum directors, and even artists, and architects who seem to not be able to find any kind of middle ground, in my experience. And I should put my cards on the table here because I'm married to an artist, but any kind of middle ground in terms of what makes for an appropriate space to look at and experience art. I think that in that sense, I find it interesting that you're not the first architect who's gone back to the Guggenheim, which in the popular imagination is considered the example of an architect's megalomaniacal ego getting in the way of the art, and who's gone back to that particular building to try to rethink it and find a way to turn it into something that's acceptable. And as I think I mentioned you before, you can go back all the way to Rem Koolhaas's Kunsthal in Rotterdam, buildings like Ben van Berkel's Mercedes Museum. I would even argue Zaha Hadid's Maxi Museum, which we can talk about in Rome, which is a kind of an unfurling of the ramps of the Guggenheim, but raises some of the same questions, are all ways of kind of reinterpreting this, and certainly your museum is a way of reinterpreting. And in that sense, I think a kind of a almost romantic, very idealistic idea about trying to find a way to make these two things fit together. And the third point I think we could talk about, if we have time, is the question of also execution, both in terms of issues like you raised in terms of entry and looking at Wright, Gehry, MoMA and your building, and how those questions were negotiated. And also in terms of, in the most pragmatic way, gallery spaces, and how it is that we look at art, and how the galleries reflect your understanding of that. So maybe we should go back to the beginning and start with a conversation about what it was you were coming out of in a very concrete way at the particular moment when you got the commission. What it was you were trying to avoid.
Probably it's something I'm kind of always worrying about, and I'm still trying to avoid, which has something to do with the expression of the will of architects, of the architect. And of course, one struggles with it because one is seeking so much to fulfill a certain view, a certain idea born in very particular sources and ideas of architects that clearly were very individual. And so it is what I called ambivalence. It's some kind of sublimation in a way that needs to be deployed through techniques. And so, for example, I do think it's quite a different thing than, and I think you have said so, than what Gehry did, or that maybe I think Zaha did with the Maxi. I think despite its very obviously conspicuous and different form, even on the outside, there's a kind of logic, there's a kind of discipline that marks itself and that I hope moves it into a different discourse than that of the expression born in the gesture, born in the individual's desire to make a point. I mean, the building should be about something else and yet not disappear, as you said. So there is this problematic of what I would call a sublimation of the expression of the individual that was on my mind. And I think Bilbao raised that, and then, of course, this idea is taken to its limit by the MoMA. So somehow this is there. The other thing I have to say is that I enjoy, and I think many at the GSD do, there's a culture here of enjoying the ways in which the constraints of architecture will bring us into new solutions and force us to invent things. And to discover constraints as the source of invention is a big part of this. And the constraints are many. You've seen the site and all of that. But I would say probably most important of the constraints would be the curator, who was there, the lead curator, who was simultaneously, and this is very unusual, the director of the museum, Moti Omer, who passed away tragically only months before the building opened. He was an amazing person because he was both in both of those roles, and I dare say because he knew so much about what was wrong with what architects do with galleries that nothing of that very bad kind could occur. He was very protective of the way lighting would work. And we went to so many galleries that he didn't like so that I could learn what was wrong. And he wouldn't let me have natural light in these galleries.
What were some of the galleries you went to?
We went right around here. He took me over into the old Fogg and showed me the way 3 different directions of light were hitting, causing multiple shadow castings on objects that were very distressing to him. He couldn't stand any of the galleries we visited in Boston, by the way. He thought they were all deeply flawed in terms of mainly of light problems. We didn't see then the new MFA renovation. It wasn't finished. But we did see the ICA, which was under construction. I won't tell you what he said about it. And we saw these museums all around. But
the interesting thing is, well, one of the things you did is you do return to, I mean, in the Guggenheim Bilbao, which is also a commentary on the Guggenheim in New York, obviously. And one of the way he breaks up the narratives, and also one of the ways that Gehry deals with the complaint that architects, in terms of architects and their relationship to art and showing art, is by coming up with 3 different spaces, types of spaces. They're the orthogonal galleries, which are for smaller paintings. There's the big kind of whale's belly, which is some kind of warehouse, interpretation of a warehouse space, and then those smaller spaces. You constrained yourself to rectangular galleries, essentially, but then distort them, right, by ripping them open as you kind of torque the building and allow for certain views in and out of them. Why do you decide to restrain yourself to rectangular galleries? Does that have to do with the curator, or was that something that you felt was important in terms of showing art?
Well,
or were you told rectangular, rectangular, rectangular?
He did say that, and he gleefully said, to me than when he met me. I'm hoping for a miracle that you could make a building with rectangular galleries in this site with this shape. He knew it was a problem. Of course, it's a delicious game to try to play to put rectangles in a shape like that. And of course, that's what leads to the Lightfall, which should reconcile that with the many, contesting geometries. The wonderful problem. If you don't hold on to this rigid requirement, everything falls apart. The constraint isn't in play. The opposite of the voice of the architect isn't there. You don't have the force of architecture acting on you. Having those rectangles is basically to reckon with architecture for me. And that is what it did. It forced things to happen. Of course, not all of them are, and things later happen to distort. And one of the rooms that's supposed to be a rectangle is slightly not, because a giant truss has to cantilever the corners of the building, which are struggling to deal with sequences outside. And so there are a number of things that end up, it's like a tail that, an animal that bites its own tail. The building ultimately betrays some of its own principles due to the constraints that it keeps bringing to bear through its own production. But those were not volunteered, as it were, from the beginning. Something happened along the way. And I think the building largely got better as the constraints kept acting on it. I wanted to answer your latter part, though, about execution, because I think it goes to some of these questions of what architecture does. One of the really interesting things that I learned from this experience was the significance of material choices and how powerful and politicized those choices are. And I think this says a great deal about the context of buildings. The situation buildings find themselves in different contexts, cultural contexts. In Tel Aviv, it was mandated almost from the beginning that this building be stone, and that it represent, therefore, a connection to a kind of civic architecture held high and identified, actually, with Jerusalem, more so with Tel Aviv, where any building of importance monumentally should be stone. And the director was absolutely adamant about the fact that it be stone. And so the panelization was dedicated to making it possible to make it stone. But then we ran into a very serious set of technical problems arising from hanging them upside down, and many things occurred. But along the way, finally, I really always wanted it to be concrete. And it's interesting to find out how much resistance was born in this idea of, how much came out of that? What kind of fight came out of trying to make this building concrete?
Well, it raised a lot of structural issues, first of all, right?
No, it was that it represented something that no one wanted to see, which was a building that might even recall the bad, now bypassed brutalist period of modernism, which has gone kind of, sour, or military buildings, infrastructural buildings in Israel that are not thought to have the qualities you would ever want a public building to have. So it's interesting that the symbolic importance of the material was a lightning rod in this project, and that we overcame it. I think the form overcomes it. I think by transforming it into something alive with the potential to see it as curved, for example.
Well, this has something to do with the collection, because you haven't mentioned, the collection is a collection of modern Israeli art mostly, and then the Western or European art, in the collection is housed in the old building. That's pretty much the way it's broken down. So part of it is also entering this conversation with the larger world in terms of the relationship between modern Jewish art and modern art happening at the center, really, in Europe and then the United States.
Yes.
And was that something that came up in terms of how you were trying to understand how to place this museum both in the context of Tel Aviv, which also is a city with Bauhaus roots, and in the context of the larger world?
Exactly. I think this actually enters into that because it's this concrete and it looks almost like it's metal, by the way, because the scale of these panels and their smoothness and there's strange shape and all of that. It doesn't seem to be concrete. They're precast, but it's very different than Zaha and Wolfsburg casting in place. It has a very different impact because of how smooth and reflective they are. So they're very evocative, even of other materials. And I would say that this internationalizes the building in some way. I have to say it's true. I think that's how it's seen. And it's somewhat alien in that sense, even though it's so knit into the site. It's both alien and completely contextual in a way. related to the Bauhaus too. And so it's a very, again, ambivalent and quivering between these things. But it did break this pattern of the stone building as the material of civic buildings. And in that sense, I think it's moving out of Israel. And that was, I mean, he did invite a foreign architect. I mean, I never could get to the bottom of why he did that. I mean, he was so dedicated to the idea that it be about Israeli art and be dedicated to it. But he had it in his mind that it had to be designed by, not by an Israeli. So it was always about this tension.
So from the beginning, that tension was inherent in terms of the way he approached the whole project.
Yes.
Was that something you discussed with him often, or it was something that you read through conversations about the building?
It went through the process, but he did one day finally explain to me his vision, and it did have something to do with him bringing this foreign representation to Israel of a different museum that would then represent and hold the very art that's local and put it into the context of the international, by having it housed in a building that could be elsewhere. I think it's, and the execution is absolutely fundamental to it. If we hadn't had the if we couldn't have achieved the luster of something that would distance it from the other concrete, of all of the other concrete buildings that Israel really, if it couldn't have been some other material that it set up, it wouldn't have been able to make it. It's how it was built.
It brings to mind a completely, in some ways unrelated, in some ways related building, which is IMP's Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, which in a way tries to bridge similar themes, of course, because it's designed by and paid for by a government. It has all kinds of different political implications because it has to do with shaping a national identity very clear. You're talking about a specific client and their own particular, a very personal perspective on these relationships. But they talk about similar relationships, how you start to knit together these different points of view, or a narrative about not only seeing paintings, but your own culture and its place in the world.
It's interesting you put it that way because it calls to question who establishes this narrative. I mean, you're describing this now in relation to the Doha situation. And I guess one of the lessons I learned, and many architects know this, is that if you have a good client who utterly controls the project, you have the best situation. I mean, I was lucky because, about building by committee, who would have gotten away with these residual spaces of such ridiculous shapes and kind? There was a point in time when he looked at the building and he said, what are all these cockamamie shapes and angles, and what is that room? I mean, he didn't know what was going on. He was lost. I mean, but he trusted me. Because he trusted me, we did it. And you can't gain that trust in so many productions of buildings. So these situations are everything. I mean, it's the difference between making a great building and not, whether you're going to be trusted.
Yeah.
Well, that's a slightly different topic, but it somehow relates to this question of who authors and who leads.
Yeah.
And how authoritarian the decisions are. It's funny because people now are, people didn't like that, and this one man deciding everything and all of that, but then people now are so excited, and they think there's so many different ways to operate as an artist in this environment. So it's a very ironic inversion that a building invented with such, by means that are so not democratic, by virtue of my attention to this intersection of different ways of operating in space, could lead to something very open-ended. And I think they don't know what they're going to do. They're looking for a new curator, but clearly the way they're handling the artistic culture is opening up.
Well, to come back to the narrative, one of the ways you break with, one of the reasons that I think the original Guggenheim is so beautiful is because Wright stuck to a narrative that was so strict and so incredibly clear, and he does it so quickly. I mean, you kind of slip through the two curved walls, you pop in, you can read the building, but you can't really see the art. And then you take that short ramp before switching back that kind of gives you just enough distance before you start. Or take the elevator, which does the same thing, basically, and then you start back on your descent. But here you enter, actually, the entry sequence is very interesting because you slide along the building, you stop in a lobby, and then you cross at the center point, right? And then you can go in either direction, so you start to invent your own narrative. But that obviously raises a lot of problems, too, because you then, in a way, lose control of the narrative. But that was obviously intentional. What was the thinking there?
It is.
I mean, I think one of the problems of the Guggenheim Bilbao is that by offering all these choices, or I mean, in a way, the sequence starts the same way. It's more dramatic. You drop down the stairs, you enter the atrium, you look up, you actually look out at the water, then you look up, you orient yourself, but then you're forced to go into these different experiences, one after the other, and choose, and always come back to the atrium. And it becomes, in a way, a very disjointed, awkward experience. You basically have to decide, what do I want to do today? Do I want to go into the kind of classic galleries, or do I want to go to the warehouse, or do I want to... I mean, in a way, this is a third approach that's very different. I mean, it's more controlled than what happens at Bilbao, but it's certainly not the same thing. That it's not as rigid.
Yeah,
as what Wright was trying to do.
It pretty much has two linear itineraries, but yes, there are moments of multiple choice.
Right.
And it almost doomed me in the competition when a juror asked about it and interrupted me and said, "I'm lost, and everyone's going to be lost."
Mm-hmm.
I thought, "Oh, it's over." You know, it's just. But and then, with nothing to lose, I proceeded to argue for it.
But what was the argument for it?
Well,
for
there
that
were
kind of a narrative?
multiple collections. I mean, there really are. There's a photographic, there's a drawing, there's a drawing collection, there's a print collection, there's painting, and I mean, there really are different kinds of galleries for different kinds of things, and they're permanent collection parts. I mean, they'll be changing, rotating, and then they have temporary big halls for temporary works. And I think the building is small enough, and with the centralized focus, and the way actually you end up moving, and the section moves you up and down, it's very motivated to kind of move you. It is, despite not being absolutely prescriptive, a building which you tend to see all of well. So I think it works. I was wondering if we could, because we have just a little time, and I thought it would be nice if people had any.
Is there a microphone or? Over here.
My friend Matthew.
Hi. Scott, I have a question about, it's sort of an observation question about the narrative that you and Carl did that's in the lobby. From afar, in a way, as a whole, the narrative to me reads almost as a teleological perspective of how the building develops, where you go from an origin state to an origin state, where an ideal to the reality, or from the reality to the ideal. But when you zoom into the interior of the narrative, you actually sort of see that the transformations that are happening are not as sort of, they're not, it's not smooth causality, sort of one thing always sort of leading to the next in a smooth way. There's a lot more sort of abrupt battling between the contingencies, especially with these different almost subjectivities of the different building programs. And in that sense, it reads more as a non-teleological perspective. And so I also see a parallel with that with the building, where the facade, when it's sort of from outside, it gives the impression of it being this smooth, continuous surface, and yet it's actually arising out of something a lot less smooth on the interior. And so I guess, in short, I'm wondering what your view is on truth.
Oh, wow. That was great punchline. My goodness, anything but true it is, let me tell you. Gosh, I'm not sure how to answer you, Matthew. I mean, it is very strangely, I think, an extremely linearly developed description. And this is what was so torturous and so thrilling about it. Because as you know, all narratives of diagrammatic development formally of buildings go in multiple directions, or multiple, intersecting. This is growing and changing that way, and this, and then they converge. And when you do these things, they become very complex. And yet, like film, if you were to try to, or like any written work, you try to simply proceed in real time, narratively, to explain a building. This is another constraint, a very significant and exciting constraint. I think acting linearly in a narrative about formal development of a very complex building like this is a little bit like the opposite of something like one of my favorite films, which demonstrates a very important idea, Sleep, which cancels narrativity in film to sort of do something film can't do. This is what architectural formal work cannot do, which is to actually run through something very smoothly, linearly. And I mean, I don't mean like in the way of growth in form parametric transformations like animation. It's not animation. It's got all the multiple causes, whether they be that the galleries insist on their squareness or the entry be developed in a particular way, or the need for light, or the structure imposes itself. Every cause that was significant when every turn was taken in the development of the idea is embodied in that, and yet it manages to proceed. And I believe in a quite convincing, I mean, I think if you actually look at it, everything follows one from the other. And it was very painful to try to break it apart and get it to be, explained in this 50-step staged, story. A very powerful idea. By the way, it comes out of a lot of work of thinking by the people who've done all of that in the past, the Rowe and Bitkover and Peter Eisenman and all of those people, and a very important figure who taught me a great deal named Doug Graff. And of course, out of the way that geometry itself moves through certain procedures to generate its forms. It itself, geometry has a particular logic, which is developmental and linear. All of these combined are what is behind that new, I hope, a different way of narrating form.
Hi. Listening to you speak of the negotiation between the different programs kind of brings to mind a cinematic process. And my question is the final building the last frame of the sequence, or is it an intermediate frame, catching it in the act?
Is it the last frame, did you say?
Is it a kind of a conclusion? Frame? Is it the last frame of the sequence of the negotiation, or is it kind of a intermediate frame that would be catching the negotiation as it's taking place?
I wouldn't say last, but it might be all of the frames, or the optimal compression of the whole story. I don't know if it's just a fragment, one in the middle of that. I don't think of it as something on the way to something, and it's not in this kind of continuous process, and we just clipped out a piece of a fragment of a process. I don't want the building to be seen that way, really as something that could have begun at any point and end at any point, and that it just stopped, and we picked a place to stop. So I can't say it's the middle frame.
But it does have a final layout, and the final relationships have been established.
Yes, and there is speculation in that representation that it isn't necessarily done yet, or that it stopped for certain reasons, that it could have gone forward. We see there what is sometimes called lateness or early. The lightfall reaches a mature form, and it's resolute in how it occupies the building. But there's another space in the library that isn't, and that could continue to develop had it not been for some other things that happened. It can't go on, but it's precluded from what is implicitly a next stage of transformation. Anyway, though, I think that the metaphor only can go so far, by the way. in this, I really only introduced this idea of film to you because I wanted to make the analogy in the inverse, that a film like Warhol's Sleep, of course, is trying to stop film, and this is trying to stop motion also in a certain way, the motion, or reconstitute it.
Thank you.
So quiet.
I know. Well, there's someone here.
Yeah, I find it, it's a very interesting building, very, certainly shows a great deal of talent and imagination. But my question would be if you could explain more the inspiration of what the aesthetic is based upon. Like, some of the images reminded me of the beauty of a great iceberg, or the beauty, the natural phenomena of a glacier, with all of its complex geometries. And in that sense, I think it's, hangs together quite nicely. But those geometries were the result of a very natural phenomenon. And so that raised the question I've always had about, say, Frank Gehry, which I think you've outdone, but that, could you explain the inspiration of the aesthetic? Is it in any way dependent upon distortion and twisting for that kind of aesthetic interest? Do you understand the nature?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question because it's difficult to answer, and maybe this is where I'm going to Nicolai saying it was refreshing that there was genealogy, but I might not refresh you when I say, that might not be so refreshing when I say that I'm not so ready or willing to admit or to even try to know why I would like the building to look this way. It's an interesting problem. I mean, I confess. I know what I want it to be doing, and I know what kind of epistemological kind of framework I'd like it to be in, and I know how I want to encounter subjects and unraveling it and such things as that, but I can't quite say why it should have to look that way to do it. It's interesting. Anyway, how about that? I'm just going to have to leave it at that.
Any other questions, or should we end it there?
I think it might be okay. Well, thank you all, and thank you, Nicolai, so much for coming.
Thanks for inviting us.